So this is a lecture that's going to talk about the origin of species. So in the previous lectures we've taken a look at evolution, looked at how species change over time. Again, keep in mind the definition of evolution. The species change over time. The population changes. The allele frequency or gene frequencies are what are changing over time, not the individual. Individuals do not evolve. It's populations, or we could say species. So, the challenge when we talk about species is, what is the definition? How do we define species? Now, if you Google the word species, you can come up with dozens of different definitions, different ways of classifying things as species. Some people think, well, if they look the same, then they're the same species. If they're in the same area, they're the same species. If they have the exact same DNA, they're the same species, and so on. So it creates a really significant challenge when we say, oh, how do species originate? Have we created new species by selectively breeding dogs? Are Chihuahuas and Rottweilers separate species? So that is the fundamental question and the fundamental challenge when we look at origin of species. How do you know officially this particular group of individuals are a new species versus the old original ancestral species? So let's take a look at a couple of different definitions of species, the different ways we can define species. Alright, so here's our first way of defining it, or identifying species, is through what's called biological species concept. Individuals can, make sure I spell this right, individuals can mate and produce fertile offspring naturally. Okay? That's a key thing when we talk about species. So these two camels, okay, they can mate, they can produce offspring, and then their offspring can go and have more children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on. That is typically the definition of species that we work with, the biological species concept. Now, once we have the species, they are typically reproductively isolated from other populations or other species. Okay, so these camels are part of a bigger population, bigger species of camels. They reproduce, their children reproduce, or grandchildren, but they can't reproduce with other populations of camels because genetically it doesn't work and they don't produce viable offspring. Okay, so this typically is the main way we define species, the main criteria. Now, once species have evolved and you get these populations or different groups that are reproductively isolated, there are a host of things that keep them apart, that keep them isolated and separated from each other. Now, they could be in the same geographic region, they could live in the same environment, they could interact with each other, but they can't reproduce. That's the key. They cannot reproduce and have fertile offspring naturally. We're not talking about what we can do in a zoo or what we can do with genetic engineering and biotechnology. We're talking about natural processes here. Okay, so once the species have evolved, what separates them from combining or coming back together with the other similar species is a set of isolating mechanisms, or are a set of isolating mechanisms. These are things that prevent different populations from mating. So humans and chimps, separate species. We have a common ancestor that at some point, it's estimated 6, 7, 8, somewhere around there, 10,000 years ago, that population, that species diverged, and those diverged populations, the different populations, evolved eventually into humans and eventually into the chimps today. Now, what keeps us from coming back together and reforming the ancestral population are isolating mechanisms. So this young lady and that chimp, they're not going to reproduce. They're not going to mate. They are not going to have offspring, fertile young. They're not going to do it naturally. Okay, so let's look at the different isolating mechanisms. These are things that keep different populations from mating and producing these different offspring. All right, so isolating mechanisms are broken into two categories: prezygotic and postzygotic. Zygote. Remember that term from back in meiosis and reproduction. Zygote is the structure that forms when the egg and the sperm come together. So prezygotic are blocks that don't even allow the egg and the sperm to come together. You don't get to mate, or the egg and sperm don't come together in a prezygotic isolating mechanism. Okay, so the first one here is called ecological or habitat isolation. If you live in different environments, you can't reproduce. So you got a lion living in the savanna of Africa and you have a tiger living in the jungles of Asia. They're not going to come across each other naturally in the wild and try to reproduce. Their territories, their home ranges, their habitats do not overlap. Okay, so an Illinois-based example, white-tailed deer are all over Illinois, and if we go down to Florida, we have a thing called the key deer. They're very similar. Key deer are a lot smaller, but they live in different geographic regions. They're not geographically compatible. You don't have deer from Illinois road tripping to Florida to try to find a mate and reproduce. So if you are in different habitats, you're not going to reproduce because you simply don't ever see each other and have that opportunity. Okay, so ecological habitat is our first prezygotic isolating mechanism. The second prezygotic is what's called behavioral. So a behavioral type of isolation, the dance. So check out the link here. It goes to I think it's either Nova or National Geographic video on the birds of paradise. These guys have this incredibly elaborate dancing ritual. It's only going to appeal to females of their species. So the picture here, and you can't get a lot out of the picture, but the picture here is of blue-footed boobies. And that's the male on the left. And he's dancing. Stands on one foot, leans over, stands on the other, rocks back to the first foot. And he just goes back and forth, trying to impress the female who's sitting next to him. She's going to watch. If she's impressed, she may consent to mating. But I guarantee you, if there's a turkey nearby, or a crow, or whatever other shorebirds are in this community, they're not going to recognize that dance. They don't know what the heck this bird's doing. The females are not going to be impressed, and they're not going to crossbreed. You're not going to have these other species wanting to breed with this male blue-footed booby because they just don't recognize his dance. So we see behavioral isolation causing different species to avoid reproduction. It prevents them from breeding. Now, granted, this applies primarily to the animal world. This is an isolating mechanism that doesn't work with plants, doesn't work with fungi and other species, but it is an isolating mechanism that prevents two different species from reproducing. All right, our third type is what is called temporal isolation. Okay, so temporal is when you have different breeding seasons. So the species are similar. They could probably reproduce, but they just don't hit the breeding season at the same time. So look at our wood frog and our leopard frog. Okay, so peak breeding for the wood frog typically is the later part of March. The leopard frogs don't breed until the early part, first week, second week almost, of April. So the male wood frog is looking for a mate. He's singing, he's dancing, he's trying to find a female, he's going to jump around the pond looking for her. The female leopard frogs, they have no interest in mating at that time. So he's ready, he's wanting to mate. Female leopard frogs are not. Female wood frogs are, because the females are ready to mate at the same time the males are. They go into the breeding season at the same time. Now when the leopard frogs go into the breeding season, most of the female wood frogs and the male wood frogs are done. Granted, you look and there is an overlap of their breeding seasons right here. And you can see there's an overlap. Some of the leopard frogs will be ready to mate while there still are wood frogs ready to mate. But it's not as likely. They don't have a perfect overlap. Their peaks are not synced. So having a different breeding season helps decrease the chances that two different species are going to reproduce with each other. Okay? So there could be some of that, but is the song going to be right? Is the behavior going to be exactly the same? Are they even going to be in the same environment? All those other mechanisms may stack up to prevent two different species from breeding. Now let's say a wood frog and a leopard frog, a male wood frog and a female leopard frog, do happen to sync up, and the song is okay and the dance is okay and they're in the same pond. The next mechanism is most likely going to block successful reproduction, and this is known as mechanical isolation. Okay, simply the parts don't fit. Okay, so you got a wood frog and a leopard frog. It's not going to work. Physically, it may not work out. One might be too big for the other one. The parts may not line up. Square peg in a round hole just doesn't work that well. You consider the bee on the right-hand image picking up pollen from one plant. When that bee goes to a different species and that pollen gets dropped, it may not land in the correct spot on the second species of plants, and it's not going to allow fertilization to take place and the zygote to form. So mechanical isolation is another mechanism in which two different species are blocked from reproduction. Okay, and then our third one, or fifth one, last one here for prezygotic, is what's called no gamete fusion. Okay, check out the little video here. This is coral spawning. That little cloudy stuff, that's egg and sperm being released into the water in the ocean during coral spawning. So now you have all the eggs and the sperm mixing together in the big soup. Egg bounces into sperm, and it doesn't allow fertilization. The gametes don't fuse. Okay, so we got our little cartoon here. The sperm's begging, please, please, please let me in. And the egg, no, you don't fit. You're not the right sperm. So go back to genetics, go back to meiosis and spermatogenesis. Sperm have a little cap. It's called the chromosomal cap. It's a protein structure that is produced during spermatogenesis. This protein is specific to that species. That protein is what allows it to find and actually burrow into an egg cell. So if you took sperm from a rooster and an egg from a turkey and put them together, that sperm doesn't have the right protein to be able to fertilize that egg. It doesn't work. So the gametes don't fuse. Even if all the other mechanisms have been overridden, you're in the same habitat, you figure out the dance, the breeding seasons overlap, the mechanical parts fit. Simply put, the gametes won't fuse. That will not produce a zygote. Offspring are not going to develop. So there's corn tassels there. Corn produces pollen. That pollen gets blown in the wind and it drops sometimes on the corn. Other times that pollen gets blown and it lands on apple trees, peach trees, soybeans that are in the field right next to the corn, etc. If the sperm or pollen from the corn gets to the egg of the other plant, it cannot fuse. It cannot fertilize the egg and create the zygote. This helps block two different species from reproduction. Okay, so these are natural mechanisms put in place, or that are in place, known as prezygotic blocks. In our next lecture, we're going to take a look at postzygotic. What happens if the gametes do fuse and you have a zygote?